Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. If you are on lunch, go ahead and grab yourself something to eat or drink. But if you're not, welcome and thanks for joining us. And again, we'll get started around 11:02. Okay, everyone, I'm going to give people a couple of more minutes just to trickle in during their lunch hour, and then we'll get started.
It's this quiet period before a talk where I feel like I should be multitasking.
We'll just quietly and awkwardly stare at each other. It's all good.
That's fine. I kept the hold music in my head.
I know. We need hold music or, coming on a stage, some sort of hype music before we get started on these. The people who are talkers are getting antsy.
All right, I think we will get started over here. Thank you everyone for joining me today with Emily and Scott for our talk about quality and agility from a QA person's perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and do a brief introduction. So let's welcome Scott. He's been doing full stack development and QA since 1995. He's been writing in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript before they were cool. And he's recently moved back to Texas and become an improver, where he enjoys the opportunity to share his experience both amongst client and the community. Thanks, Scott, for doing this talk with us today. And Emily is one of our senior consultants out of the Improving Houston office. She is focused in product delivery, agility, and project management. Emily is a regular speaker, so you might have heard her before, and often a resource for companies focused on value and organizational change. So welcome, Emily. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic over to Emily and Scott. Please go ahead and put any questions you have in the Q&A section, and I will raise them as needed and during our talk or after our talk. So thanks, everyone.
And just to shout out, this is definitely a discussion, and it's going to be way more interesting and impactful if, while we're having our discussion about quality and agility and how everything interacts, if we have everyone who's taken the time to attend to ask questions, drop your opinion, really just take a moment to let us know what you're thinking. Scott and I definitely will welcome that. And I think it's an important part of any of these discussions is just make sure that we are touching on everyone's thoughts. Scott, anything to add to that?
It's no irony that there's a Q&A in our presentation as well as a way to ask questions and get answers. So
yeah. We'll even, if you ask nicely and raise your hand, let you come off mute and ask them too if you want. Wonderful. Well, Himika, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Scott and I added our welcome slide onto here. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I always feel self-conscious about my rainbow of certifications. But really and truly, we just want to touch on, Scott and I have had the opportunity to work together professionally on an internal product. We've definitely shared ideas across our own clients here at Improving. And so it is an absolute honor for me to be able to take some time to have this discussion with Scott about quality and agility, knowing that he is my go-to for these types of questions.
and then it's partially mine, honestly, because I appreciate the fact that I have Emily over here curious enough about quality from an Agile perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're both, like I said, a little bit about us. We are both professionals and I don't want to say experts because that feels so strange, but we're both considered resources in our area from our background. So we'll be able to leverage that and just have a really great discussion today. So before we kick off with our discussion, I just want to make a note. Why are we even talking about quality? This is Agility Month here at Improving. We've had a whole lineup of fantastic speakers talking about Agile and different Agile practices. So why did we decide to pivot and start talking about quality, which is not something that comes up frequently in agility? Well, it's because while it doesn't always come up frequently as a very specific topic of quality, quality and agility is really at the heart of why we do what we do. And as we go through today and talk through our experience and what we've seen in the field, I think that'll hammer home what we mean when we say quality is kind of at the heart of agility. Really and truly, Agile is about adapting to changes rapidly. But it's not about sacrificing what is bringing value when you do that. And the difference between adapting quickly with no quality and adapting quickly with quality is the value you get at the end. And ultimately, when we bring in agility practices, our job is to make sure that we're able to deliver quality products and quality implementations. So agility also helps set the standard for allowing for an organization to set those quality standards and start defining what is going to bring value. As we discussed today, one of the important things is, although QA isn't necessarily a named party in a lot of the agility frameworks, it is absolutely at its core part of the agility team, and recognizing that partner, regardless of title, is going to make sure to bring value into what you're doing. So I said here, like it or not, quality is a part of value, and it's often undervalued in conversations.
Emily, we have a question here.
I love it.
Awesome.
How do you justify the assertion that quality brings value to customers?
Oh, that's a really good question. We are definitely going to take a deeper dive over in some of the other slides, but at its kind of, if I were to answer that from an agility perspective, now I'm not going to have to tell Scott to earmuff because we've talked about this, but from an agility perspective, when we talk about being able to delivering poorly done items doesn't bring value. And
Right.
so quality, as we're going to discover through our discussion, isn't one thing. And so the assertion that you have to have quality to add value is true. Now, quality doesn't mean readmes and documentation and regression testing. And it doesn't mean all of those things necessarily. Quality, as we're going to discuss, is an agreement and a way for us to ensure that when we deliver, that thing is valuable. You don't want to get a guest bathroom made and then get it without a toilet and a shower and a door, even though they've technically done it. And so quality is making sure that we're delivering what we're supposed to, when we're supposed to, and the standards that we need to. Anything to add to that, Scott?
Quality assures that the value of what's being defined is represented in every aspect of the production of that product.
Yeah.
So that you have something that, and the definition can be absolutely mutable, as we'll see as we go through these slides, as to what is quality, because it is defining the value with that quality.
Now, I don't want to do too many spoilers because I know we're going to get into it. But before we continue to touch on that question, I'm going to pivot over because I think we need to start with what is some terminology. And I think what's really important and why Scott and I wanted to start here is, if I'm being honest, as an agile professional, I don't see the same terminology in agility as I do with many of our QA professionals. And so I wanted to take some time to talk with Scott on a couple of terms, because I feel like myself, I'll hear many of these, but I don't always understand what that means in the practical application of my product work or agile transformation or anything like that. So we picked out a couple of terms that we really wanted to start with and start talking through. The first one being quality standards. And I think that touches on the question that we got is, what is this?
Right. So the qualities that you consider to be quality is part of what we're trying to define here. And it seems like, definition of a definition don't define, term with the same term. But what it really speaks to is when you have a value statement, you have an outcome that you're trying to make. What is quality in each of those steps of that process, right? You know that there are going to be things that need to be defined as far as what the business expects out of the end product, what the users expect out of the end product, because sometimes those may differ. It's not to say that they won't overlap on occasion, but sometimes there are those aspects that aren't defined by just what the business assumes a user may or may not want. So user feedback is part of that. So there are standards that you can put on the front end of things, as well as, in the middle. Obviously, a huge quality standard would be security, to be able to say that this application runs within a certain set of standards such that I am assuring the quality of the security of the application, of a user's information, things of that nature.
Now, I know we work on an internal product together, and one of the things that I found fascinating, and I know we're going to touch on it with some of the other terms, but when we talk about quality standards, we have, I don't want to say shifting standards because then it takes away the idea of standards, but based on the stakeholders we work with, there are different there can be different definitions of what they expect for quality based off of who our end users are, the level of interaction we have with other parts of the systems, what other processes it interacts with. Is that something you see with the quality standards? Like I said, I know that that's what we've come up with, but are you seeing other organizations help define quality standards based on specific circumstances?
Well, obviously, the communication between them helps to define what there are as far as expectations from everybody. Then it becomes, I don't want to say so much of a matter of negotiation, but it's an understanding of that effectiveness that happens back and forth, how one's effects affect someone else. But to have a negotiated sense of these are what we all understand are being quality aspects. Do we take the extra time to do a certain type of verification, or are we okay with a certain level of authentication in the site that doesn't require a user to use multi-factor authentication? There may be situations where that's not necessary for the level of risk of data exposure that you might have for a particular product or application. Or maybe it's under an umbrella where it's an internal application where you don't have to worry about those aspects. So you could use some other level of security. So a definition is built by those communication channels and those opportunities to express what I consider risky, what I consider best behaviors.
Starts to make us sound like we're having to work together.
Exactly.
Which is a
And,
good
that's
opportunity.
the shifting left as well,
Yeah, I was going to say
understand-
this is a term I'd heard in spaces, but I couldn't tell you what it meant.
Well, a lot of definitions seem to think that it's a direction on the board, right? So there's a relationship to Agile where you have columns of work and workflows and processes that start from the left and work towards the right. We all know how that kind of works in an Agile process.
So looking at our Scrum board or a Kanban board, we have ready to test right outside of deployment, moving that forward to where we're doing our actions or even just preparing the backlog. Some people use a definition of ready for development or something, almost moving the QA status there.
Right. So there are those buckets of role responsibility, if you will. So we know that, during an active stage, development's working on it, but that doesn't mean that it's only development. We're throwing it over to the wall to the next phase. What it means is that each role has a finger in the pie of quality, right? So if we go back to a concept of a production line where you have individuals, be it an automobile, be it a pair of pants. I use a pair of pants because we used to get tickets in our pocket that said, inspected by number whoever. And that meant that somewhere along the line, somebody said, hey, did everybody do their job? That's part of it, right? But the shifting left is more about what is my role's expectations as far as quality. Go back to standards and look at a development role, right? What are the standards of quality that are being put upon developers specifically, such that they have a direct role in how the quality is reported and affects the next series of roles and the next series of steps in the work process.
So similar to the work that we've done together, where our tickets are ready when we know what our test cases should be and who does it. And then even you and I will have a conversation with the team on thresholds for acceptance or kind of where this goes and what kind of standards need to be considered as we build it out. And so that makes it sound more like a team setting, which goes on to our next one.
Exactly. And you keep that conversation going in that shifted left fashion, such that during development, you have the opportunity to say, well, we didn't expect, or this wasn't discussed during planning. This wasn't discussed during our three amigos. I don't like using the term, but it's another one of those terms that I didn't see on our previous slide, where it's a conversation amongst all the stakeholders, the people who are doing the development, who are doing the documentation of the development, if there is such, all those who are involved. But it's that conversation that you continue to have throughout each stage, such that if you do run into hey, here's an edge case, because I'm a tester and I've looked at a series of tests and I've looked at previous tests, or I've looked at other documentation that says, a user uses this in a certain way where we weren't expecting it. And you iterate and you keep it in that column because you're discussing, not having to go back each time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know we
Sorry,
work
Emily.
closely together, and you talk about the Scrum team. You've got the developers, the product owners, and the Scrum masters, and then you expand out for all of those. But for our work, our quality team is, it's all of our stakeholders, and so
Exactly.
when we release new functionality in the product, I will often go out serving as PO, but it's not an avoid because you're often there with me. We're often have devs there. We talk to them about what are edge cases we can walk away from, what are the quality requirements that are coming up from here, and where are those spaces where as a team we can ensure that we're meeting their needs, giving them value, giving them quality work, but not stopping everything. Because I feel like sometimes you see that rubber band effect in sprints. We're chugging along. We've lobbed everything over, and now QA is behind.
Right, exactly. And that's why I was saying, I appreciate having, an Agile come in and say, hey, go talk about quality, because that shifting left is part of that helping. And the quality team, the definition of the quality team, means that as you start having this discussion and talking about it, you begin to shift not just to the left, but the mindset that says, okay, so it's not just our job to do our thing and toss it over the fence, right? It's all of our jobs to know, hey, I'm doing this over here, and this means that the quality is barred up, leveled up each step along the process. You define those, you make sure you understand those, you change them agilely as the product may or may not change, as requirements may or may not change. Say you have a bug that comes in mid-sprint that happens to be about something that's there. Don't panic. You've got an opportunity to say, hey, work this into, because we're having this conversation.
Yeah. Now I think Hamika, was there a question about shifting left in the quality team before we touch on test cases?
Yes, there was. What are some effective ways to persuade stakeholders to shift quality leftwards?
That's the value.
That is the question. So first off, if we could solve
exactly,
we'd be millionaires. I can tell you from an agility standpoint, one of the biggest things when I work with my clients, and even what Scott and I had to do internally to change a lot of the conversations, is stop separating the conversation of quality or value.
exactly.
The value is the quality that you get, and value is, it's exactly why we tell people to become more agile, to increase value. But the way that you increase value is being faster, getting more feedback, and ensuring that the quality is agreed upon and released. And so part of that is, if you don't want, and I think this will be a great segue over to test cases, if you don't want to slow down your production, then quality becomes everybody's conversation. If you don't want to sacrifice the value at the end, then quality becomes everyone's discussion. If you go back to lean practices, some of the early ideas on lean and the success that the Toyotas and stuff had was quality was no longer Inspector 5 in your pants. Quality was anybody on the line stopping to say, this at this point is an immediate defect, and if it keeps rolling, that's a quality issue.
Which is one of the reasons, and speaking of, this is a great segue into test cases. One of the reasons why in our internal development project, we've empowered the developers to write test cases for what they have been working on. My background as a developer I can certainly go and look at a pull request for a particular, feature or operation and diff the code enough to say, okay, this is what was attempted to be done. But there is no better definition of what was attempting to be done than a person who writes a UI test case using a tool very quickly and easily that's provided through, say, Azure DevOps or other tools, but it allows them to go in and say, this is what I was attempting to do, and hand it to someone else.
I think that's one of the biggest successes we have is our internal team can make these test cases. So again, we're not waiting on QA. We can start to run in real time. We're getting that value turned around. And Scott, you've actually gone so far talking about getting stakeholders engaged. We've actually gone so far as to when we have some of these discovery sessions for our feature work and our feature development to actually have people walk through using some of the tools to create test cases to show us the expected functionality, which we can then plug in. We use Azure DevOps to do it. There's tons of tooling there. Yeah, but there's plenty of plugins, and so we don't even wait and have Scott build all the test cases as QA. We have our developers and our stakeholders help us create those test cases so that we can continue to validate and tell you, as somebody who talking about agility, you can release whenever you want, you can deliver value, you can do all that. Having stakeholders predefine what those test cases look like and being able to give them results at the end is huge.
And that's a definition of value where quality is directly engaged in it, where quality is directly involved, in the sense that if you spread out the quality effort, because everybody, A, can, and 2, has the skills, but also you don't bottleneck through one single set of individuals, teams, a single person sometimes, the entire process of validating what all of the previous work has done, that it has met the value statement for that feature.
Right. Well, I know we've got a segue in talking about devs writing test cases. We want to touch on who is involved with quality, but I think we've got a question before we move on to our next section.
We indeed do. Thank you, Emily. How do you encourage or train developers to write really good test cases and not just have them say, I tested everything that I could think about?
Pink slips. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Scott's he's very intimidating with how he takes it. So I, just as somebody in agility, the thing that I always like to pause on is when I don't see it in black and white. There's no such thing as a good test case or a bad test case. I'm not even looking for full testing. When Scott and I work together, again, our quality is built on what were the quality standards put in place and what is the value delivered. So I've never had a dev write a bad test case, but I have had Scott and I go back and say, I don't think that this test fully looked at all of the different elements that maybe we need to ensure that this brings value. Scott, why don't you talk on that a little bit more? Because again, I'm not the one intimidating the devs, you are.
So it comes down to a personality, difference. You have someone who wants to do this thing and investigate this thing and kick the tires further on this thing, and someone who would rather hand it off and have someone take a look at it. The encouragement comes from getting the value out of it. How do you encourage someone who's lackadaisical about it, who doesn't want to? And it's not a matter of putting the effort, but rather they feel that they have put their effort in, and anyone validating beyond that is someone else's role. Mm-hmm. That's where understanding, okay, so how did you validate? Can you tell me? Can you not prove it, but for traceability's sake, can you give me, you get hit by a bus tomorrow, I joke, Pete slip, I joked that, but in order to go back and see, do you make that a quality statement with your commits? Do you make part of your code commits be, this is what I did here, this is what I did here, so that you can follow the story of what was done, so there's no question, right? The encouragement comes from what value the product, the team, and at the end run, their paycheck. But you have to understand what drives that individual's value statement. Some it's an easy lead. Like I said, with this one developer where I said, hey, here's how you make test cases for the UI using this test and feedback. It was like, oh, wow, now I can go do this. I ain't got to lead that horse to water. But for those that do, I guess it really boils down to that encouragement that says, hey, if you do this, it means there's less iteration on your work because you've given a proof of concept as well as the concept proven. It just depends on the individual and what it is to them to make sure that they do that quality.
And I think there's absolutely value in, for some of them, I did the testing, low value ticket, small ticket. We've absolutely let stuff pass like that. But there's other more high value, high visibility items where we say, hey, let's take a look. Let's make sure this meets all the quality standards put forward.
Right.
So pivoting over, I think we touched on it a little here, but who was involved with quality? Because we tend to think of, and even I fell into this trap when we first started working together of, I'm a PO on this, I'm looking across the team. Hey, Scott, I want you to go get this stuff tested. And surprise, one person doing all the testing didn't work, but we shifted it to start to think who was involved with quality. So what roles, again, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but like what other roles do you see?
Well, it's everybody's role. It's a team effort is, a blanket statement. But you start to ask the question of what does your role care about with this feature or product, right? You start to ask the question of what is the value you get out of this particular feature set, right? Stakeholders may have a particular, well, we need to have quality metrics go up, or we need to be able to have sales go up, or there may be another consideration over here that has all of this. But as we've discussed, it's laying all of that out on the table and understanding what's your skin in the game, if you will.
Well, and then one of the things that I feel like I've really grown from our time together working on this product is my own sense of my responsibility as a quality professional. Excuse me. But and what I mean by that is, when I got my PO training and when I got all of my other training and all of my experience, so like quality is important and value is important. And then they kind of moved on. And so having a chance to work with you in being a professional who now considers myself a quality professional, all of my discussions center on that. And they center on the other two items we see here. What are our quality standards? And so when we go into discovery sessions, we talk about security, we talk about what items they are. And I think one of the other things that I've become more versed in, and we can touch on this a little bit more too, is quality code versus quality process. And I think our QA professionals, we don't give them enough credit of our quality professionals have to make sure the process works and that everything works under the hood. It's like asking a mechanic to be a car engineer as well. And it's a tough place to be.
Yeah. Excuse me, my turn. It totally is, because one of the ways that I've seen, especially with automation, meld, put the two together, it really make a gelled consensus of development, software writing, testing, and quality is that you build an idea within the developer's head of, I'm looking at this from a quality perspective. I'm looking at it from a user's perspective. I'm not just building up this thing. So there's that level of I have a standard of quality that's reporting to the UX design and things like that. But there's also that give them the opportunity to say, well, does that mean that our code reaches a certain quality? Are we linting our code to a certain level? Do we care that our code is linted to a certain level? Do we write documentation, or is it a self-documenting by virtue of how we've written test cases? Do we use our Agile tool set to lay out and define our documentation because we're using that for the tool?
Yeah, and it expands the roles right there, because we have very different conversation with our technical professionals on what are the quality standards of code, how do we reduce technical debt, how do we make sure that regression's going through, all of those things that are very standard, and our devs work with the team there. And then again, slightly more with you than with me, but there are those conversations of the balance of quality code is important, but only up to a certain point before it impacts value. And then there's a whole other group of people who help us build the quality standards for the process that we see, that more front-end manual testing of, can a user log in and complete the steps?
And
And I
part of
think
that
it comes
lateral
back to the
slice.
question. Oh, yes.
I was going to say part of that lateral slice of quality code versus quality process. There's an entire discussion set within the development community role of a project where it's okay. So now we're going to break testing down into a unit level of testing that says we've got functionality that's tested, but let's connect that up to the reporting aspect to say that this business logic was tested by a unit test in the code. But now we have an integration level that says that business logic has done something to our data. Let's test that individually and report back on that. So we've got different streams of quality testing that are specific to devs that are within a particular bucket of testing, but overall report to the quality of the application. We've done the business logic, we've done the integration, and we've done the user interface, but we've tested them separately so that they are more quickly tested. They're agilely tested. This is faster, and this is faster, and this is a little bit slower, but you're doing less of it.
Yeah. Or some of the stuff I've said, they're like, well, it'll be kind of broken, or it's not super great. And I'm like, there's no value in increasing that quality. That quality deficit is acceptable within the quality standards we've set. So one of the things that I think I'd like to take a deeper dive on is, what is quality? Because again, we've kind of touched on the different pieces and who's involved, but there's a whole greater world of, and we've touched on it, what is quality? But Hamika, I think we have a question before we move on.
We sure do. We have a question about quality standards. Are quality standards formally part of your definition of done? What kind of review at planning or tasking time do you do in order to make sure they are? Are the developers familiar with these standards?
Is it me or someone like writing our segues?
I know. I love it.
Because that's exactly what we're speaking to next.
Yeah. We'll use that as a pivot. And if we don't answer it fully, just ping again. But what is quality? Is this even a debate? And so making sure it kind of touching on this pieces. So quality at your organization, talking about definition of done, and that segue into the roles outside of developers. I mean, Scott, you and I working on our internal product, it's been a little bit different than a lot of standard teams. And so we've really kept the definition of done pretty lean, because the different types of pieces that we touch and the breadth of stakeholders that we have, we don't typically wait for it to be definition of done. We've got a few things in there to just mitigate risk of junk code going in, but more important than definition of done is the definition of ready. And so what we often do, although we don't have a formal definition of that, it puts the QA onus less on our devs to make sure it meets definition of done, which works well for a lot of traditional teams. I'm not saying don't do that. But what Scott and I have done internally working with this group is move the roles to put the onus on our stakeholders. When we go through definition of ready, we have them set the specific standards. I have had, again, this is a huge bit of trust that Improving puts on me, and Scott helps empower me. But I legitimately, in many cases, will define the definition of done for a specific area because it might be different depending on the stakeholders and the groups that we're working with. And so talking about roles outside of developers, Scott, why don't you jump onto that?
Well, and when it comes to the definition of ready and definition of done, that conversation amongst those roles is where you get that opportunity to raise your hand and say, okay, so from a development standpoint, this may or may not work for us, or we have, for example, on the internal team, we are using a very lean set of resources that are rolling in and out of the project on a regular basis. So to be able to easily pull and say, I'm going to work on a segment of work and ensure that quality is done in an automated manner from a DevOps standpoint, we have modified our Azure board to do certain things in an automated manner so that we maintain process and there's quality to the process, but it's not a developer's role to move this on the board. Because in this environment, a developer needs to come in, work, leave, because that's the nature of the resource.
Yep.
So,
and again, that
role,
goes back to definition of ready being so much more important. And we don't even use that official term, but a dev knows when they pick up that ticket has the information of what counts towards the quality standard, not the board.
It's not a standard process. We have a planning meeting when we have a resource bank that's large enough to say, all right, let's put these things in order. But to be able to cherry pick, because everything has been defined beforehand and put onto the stakeholders, devs don't have to interact from that perspective, except to say, hey, can you clarify this for me? Answer any questions.
Yeah. We will, in many cases, again, talk about roles outside of developers. One of the things that I really enjoy doing is we've gone through and clarified the items. The board helps manage all the pieces. We get ready to test, and it's turned back over to the stakeholders.
Yes.
And not just in a demo, not just in a review, but we legitimately said, you defined it up front. We validated that the team enacted what you defined. You can go sign off on it and help us understand, did this bring quality? Did it bring value? Did it meet your expectations? But we're not stuck with a specific QA person being underwater, or our dev team struggling with the definition of done that may or may not fit, or especially if they're only there for a week. But instead we can say, you knew what the value was, you knew what the quality was supposed to be. Now we can let the person who will validate it once it goes live, push it up, move the process left, now that I know what that term means, and actually validate it.
Right. And for example, some of these tickets are written with acceptance criteria that are the definition of the test cases that are written out such that you go to the board and say, hey, I'm going to run this test case. And then you've got your steps to repeat as well as your acceptance criteria already done. So that same cherry picking aspect can be done by any role whatsoever. So what we've done with this internal project is not redefined the roles, but expanded the capability of any given role by saying, we're going to do quality in this way. Yeah.
Well, and I think that goes on to the point, who defines it? We've worked with a wide breadth of stakeholders and different features and functional needs. And there are more complicated processes where the quality and the interaction that we had, the quality process and the quality code had to have a much higher level of scrutiny because of how complicated the process was and the output and the use case. And so when we've sat down with those stakeholders, it's a much more focused, defined, we've had to send tickets back that don't meet the quality definitions. We've had those places. We've also had others where we're like, it's a big win if it does this, but if it doesn't do it perfect, it's still a win. And quality was getting it done.
The beautiful nature of that dip in and out idea of this project is, as the internal users have been using this project, a lot of times there are people who say, man, this feature just, it bugs me the way that it works. So we've had the opportunity for people to come in and say, hey, I'm going to work on this thing. This thing's it's been breaking my brain trying to operate this tool this way. I've got this great idea to fix it. You know, we have predefined sets of quality rules that say when you interact with this project, do so in this manner, do these things. Like I said, we've got those automated processes so that people who aren't familiar can dip into and out of. But that's how we get a lot of bugs reported, fixed, and then validated. Is that we've got columns that are populated and people can say, I know there are test cases written for this bug. All I have to do is go and look in the ready to test column and say, hey, I contribute to this project by going and validating bugs once they're fixed. And I am a fill in the blank role.
We have a lot of our stakeholders have done our bug validation, and it is, I love doing that. I've not had a project work like that before. And then I think about this last one, how does quality impact value? To Scott's point, with the nature of this internal product that we've been working on, Scott came to me because he found a bug. So quality impacted our value in the fact that Scott reported a bug and offered to help, and we never let him go. So the low quality impacted the value for me greatly. But it is a hand-in-hand relationship, because I feel like I hear those debates a lot. And Scott, maybe you do the same, maybe you hear the same, where we're like, you can't just push junk code, it impacts the value, or there's no value in over quality and values getting it out. And I feel like it's this push and pull about quality and value and how they impact each other. And I think in my mind, a lot of that is quality impacts value. There's no doubt about it. How it impacts is going to depend on the business and the user and the needs and what we look at. And that's why we mentioned we don't have a definition of done, is because that relationship can shift.
Brief story. I just recently worked for a client that was doing an agile transformation, and their biggest question for me was, how do we fit UAT inside user acceptance testing, inside of a sprint? So I start coaching them and finding out what their, test, environment is like and all of these things. And I say, what you're going to end up having to do is get your stakeholders testing early, because that's the only way that your QA process, as you're transforming into an agile process, can be achieved in the timeframes that you're talking about. Is that you have to get your stakeholders testing. And when we started to define they started to see the slip in value, and they had been dealing with this issue for long enough that they decided to do an agile transformation in the first place, that they decided to say, here is how much that quality and the definition of doing it in our system is going to impact our value. Scott, you're too remote. Let's get someone in a local setting who can come in and coach hand in hand, right? So that's where the value of having quality defined in an agile process, you can see it in a greenfield experiment where they're going, we don't know how, so let's get someone who can help us, because it is possible, and you do want to do it from the get-go as much as you can.
So that is, again, the perfect transition to how do you see quality implemented? Because you're right. A lot of people will say, well, we want high quality, and quality impacts our value. does it go into a sprint? Is there a right way to do it? Is there a UAT sprint? And, quality is referenced in Scrum, but there's not, in Scrum and Agile, there's not really a whole lot of guidance, truly.
Right. And what I've found out working and doing Agile and Scrum and starting from a development standpoint, working through a QA standpoint, the first thing that you notice in any kind, and when I discovered this, I was part of an Agile transformation that led to discovering the bottleneck of QA, right?
Yeah.
And it had me thinking, man, why are we pushing so much into this pipeline? That was my first dive into doing any kind of automation, was to be able to say, look, let's get some of this off of the manual testing. I know you got to do it. There's no other way to do it. I mean, this was early enough to where we didn't have any kind of browser stack that could do a lot of automated,
The cool
testing
tools that we have now.
Exactly. So this was before the cool tools, but it was that opportunity to say there's not quality built into and practiced in Scrum as we are being trained to do it. And that's what started my whole QA journey.
Well, and it's when you started working with us on this internal product, you were giving a little bit of time here and there, and every time you'd be able to come back over, it was a huge stack of tickets because we ran Scrum. And although it doesn't say that you need a specific QA person, anyone could be QA, we hadn't really invested the time in how do we create quality professionals and not just a QA role. And so that was a huge shift for us. And it really made us significantly more agile whenever we stopped thinking about it as a specific role or competency in Scrum and instead brought it into a thought process and a delivery. We shifted left and we said, hey, our devs, they can't test this, but who can? That leader over there who requested this bit of information, or this person who submitted a bug because it bothered them. Like, they took the time to submit it, they'll likely take the time to test it. And so it was really nice to start to shift out of what we see when we see Scrum applied very pedantically and move into, okay, these are the thought processes that we wanted to touch on.
And the thing that would really, as you start doing these things, as others start doing these things, as quality becomes a practice, not a process, right? It starts to free up that QA for other things, like to be validating backlogs, to look at test cases that, say, devs or product owners have built out, and make sure that they are touching all of the areas and make sure, well, let's see, wait a minute, you reported about here, but did you know that? Did you realize that? And validate bugs out of the way, right? So it becomes more of you're not avoiding issues, you're not trying to get away from them, but you're managing the flow of those issues. And that's part of planning and the continuous integration aspect of it. You free up your quality professional, if you will, to be able to manage the entire flow of quality throughout the process so that things can be caught on the outside and brought into and looped through again.
Well, talk about avoidance of issues on here. One of the big things that we've seen now working together is, again, it's not something I ever got trained on, but when we talk about developing new feature sets, sometimes we'll have a BA with us, sometimes we won't, but more often than not, it's you and I talking to our stakeholders. And there are many occasions where we will say, hey, I know you're reporting that as a bug, but we're going to walk away from it because the value add, how would we test it? Is it adding issues? Is it truly impacting quality? And so we can help understand that at the front end, which I think is amazing. It's not anything I've seen before.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned lack of quality up here, because it's not that people don't care. It's not that people don't want to produce a quality product. I think a lot of times there's that I did my best kind of mentality, you know, and that handoff that says, well, that's as best as I can do, that's as clear as I can, because there isn't that communication. So I think of lack of quality, not so much as a lack of willingness or ability, but a lack of communication on what it is, what it isn't, because that's just as important. And
well, how many times have we gotten something where they're like, oh, that wasn't a quality implementation, and we sit down to understand it, had nothing to do with quality, but there was a lack of training or understanding or how something worked. I mean, quality can be, we talk about quality standards and we try to get people engaged. There's still very much that element of you've got to be really clear on it.
Right. And that's looping back around with that quality is also that, see, we've gone through and we've taken what we've learned from this interaction with this. Well, we thought it was supposed to be this way, and now it really is more like this. And we've talked to the users and put it out there for them to see and gotten the feedback for it. And we come back and we say, well, we did right, but here's another adjustment, you know, and
iterative developments.
Exactly, you know, and I know that you and I have talked about, I don't know how many others, you know, stakeholder wise have talked about, but our goal with this internal project is to get us to that continual integration perspective. And we're doing it by packing as much quality from each professional in every touch that they do, by defining what quality is and isn't on each touch that they do, their awareness of it, or they're not necessary to be aware of it because it's automated, right? That they can come, interact, and go by being professionals and practicing quality with little, not definition, but little lack of definition. Right? A leaner approach to saying, this is what we expect out of quality when you come in, work on it, it's done, so that we have a backlog for release that we can then do on a very regular basis.
Exactly. Well, and then the last one is lack of quality professionals. And we don't have to touch on that too much because the answer should be everybody is a quality professional. Now, I think it's important to understand that I couldn't just come in and flip the quality switch. And so I don't want to devalue our QA partners. Their QA partners are so important in your agile transformations and your product delivery. Our QA partners are absolutely pivotal in ensuring that these are here. But our QA partners, I mean, you've mentioned before, Scott, it wasn't that your role here in our work together wasn't to come in and be QA where you manage the column. It was to be a QA expert, a quality expert, to come help guide us on, let's balance out quality and value. Let's ensure that we're using the tools needed. Let's educate our stakeholders on quality and really and truly put forth the guidance to make all of us quality professionals. So we no longer lacked that. We never don't have a quality professional available.
If I can't walk away from a project, be it a client or an internal project like this, and be able to say, hasta la vista, put on my hat and go off into the sunset, I didn't do my job because I didn't teach you how to be a quality professional within your role. I'm not teaching quality. I'm not being a quality assurer if I haven't given you the tools to do that.
Yeah. Well, I want to be conscientious of time. We are at the 5-minute mark, so I wanted to open it up if there were any other thoughts or questions or what we missed. And I do think we've got somebody who dropped a question, Hamika.
That's right. So the question comes from Lawrence, who asks, what are effective ways to communicate quality requirements to developers?
I'll let you take this, Scott. I have some ideas based off of our interaction, but again, I lean on you as the expert.
You know, honestly, when I was doing my first agile transformation and I was doing the quality and all, that was that very many hats that I was wearing.
Yeah.
What I found very helpful was to sit at a table with everyone and literally hack a prototype together, right? It doesn't do the things, the back end doesn't work, it doesn't do all of that stuff. But what it does is it gives everybody the opportunity to see what the user will see, how the user will interact with it. And this includes the developers, because in hacking together a prototype, changing up the color scheme, whatever you need to do, go in and throw in an input here. It doesn't work, doesn't do anything, but it's on the page. What it does is it gets that. If you've ever played the game where you've got words and you build a sentence with magnets, it's that. It's just that right there. So how do you get them engaged in the requirements? Literally let them hack a prototype while you're sitting there with the stakeholders and saying, this goes here and this does this. Well, wait a minute, if we put this here, if we make this drop down, do this, if it has these options, does that mean that we need to do this on the next page or not? It generates the conversation.
You start to bring them into that. And it's not just because I feel like selfishly, I feel like a lot of the lack of communication, or I don't want to say the lack of communication, I feel like the lack of investment that some developers have in QA practices. I don't want to say quality practices, I'll say QA practices, isn't because there's a lack of interest, but I don't think that there's always that return on investment visible. And I feel like, to your point, walking through with the stakeholder, understanding those pieces, tying it all in together creates a sense of value and investment. And when we go through agile transformations or talk about that with the clients, we talk about the importance of breaking down silos and making teams who can be self-managing and work together. And then oftentimes we turn around and say, okay, devs, go over there now. And so I think continuing to build on that really gives that sense of value that helps devs feel invested in it as a process and not just a step along a board.
Exactly. Show them their value and how their input is valuable and how they can shape the input from others by their knowledge, because that's valuable to them too, to anybody.
Well, I know we're at the 2-minute mark, although I would love to take more questions. I don't think we have time, but I do want to encourage you, if you have any questions after this, feel free. You can reach out to Scott and I at our improving email addresses. Those are QR codes for our LinkedIn. So if you'd like to reach out by LinkedIn, if you had a question about any of the items that we discussed, want to get some ideas, want to learn more about what we've learned from our partnership together and how to apply that at your client or your company or your team, we're happy to help. As you can tell, we enjoy talking. So don't ever hesitate to reach out. Scott, any final thoughts before we part way?
No, I just want to thank you for bringing me into this conversation, for the opportunity to have the conversation, the opportunity to be able to say we all understand quality and we can all bring it.
Yes. And thank you for giving your time. As this is Agility Month, and again, being an agile professional and feeling like quality is important, but not always having the tools or even the language to help implement it. It has been game changing for me as a professional to work with Scott and gain all of that knowledge. And it's made our internal project so much more fun and enjoyable. So Scott, thank you for giving your time today to share with everybody who joined on their lunch break a little bit more insight and hopefully some tools to help build quality and value into the areas they're working on.
Happy to do it.
All right, everybody. Hamika, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks so much for doing the talk, Scott and Emily, and everyone that came and was very, very engaging. Thank you for taking time out of your lunch break. We do have next month in May, our theme is modern app development. So if you're more into technical type talks, I think that's going to be a great month for that. The first talk is by Marina Borishkevich. Sorry if I butchered her name completely. That will be next Wednesday, and I've left a registration link in the chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.